There's a peculiar silence in the prepper community, a gap between what people display on YouTube and what they actually rely on when infrastructure collapses. Walk into any preparedness expo and you'll see the usual suspects lined up in pristine rows. Freeze-dried meal buckets stacked like fortifications, hand-crank radios gleaming under fluorescent lights, first aid kits sealed in plastic wrap that's never been opened. These items represent the public face of readiness, the socially acceptable acknowledgement that sometimes the systems we depend on fail. But there exists another layer beneath this visible inventory, a shadow category of tools and supplies that experienced preppers accumulate quietly, discuss rarely, and never photograph for social media. These are the items that occupy the back shelves of locked storage rooms. The gear that gets mentioned in hushed conversations between people who've actually lived through prolonged crises, rather than merely theorized about them. The distinction between these two tiers isn't arbitrary or rooted in paranoia. It emerges from the hard lessons of real-world supply chain breakdowns, economic disruptions, and infrastructure failures that have repeatedly exposed the inadequacy of mainstream preparedness advice. Understanding this hidden layer requires examining not just what these items are, but why they remain deliberately obscured from public discourse despite their critical importance when conventional systems break down. I need you to stay with me through this entire examination because the relationship between forbidden preparedness items and genuine crisis resilience can't be understood through simple lists or surface-level explanations. The distinction matters profoundly as we navigate an era marked by increasing supply chain fragility, economic volatility, and infrastructure vulnerabilities that previous generations never confronted at this scale. Before we catalog the specific categories, we must first understand the structural reasons why certain survival tools occupy this controversial space, legal gray areas that vary wildly by jurisdiction, social stigmas attached to bulk purchases of particular goods, surveillance concerns that emerge when citizens stockpile beyond government-approved quantities, and ethical considerations that arise when scarcity transforms everyday items into valuable commodities. Take a moment to comment below where you're watching from, your city and country, because regional differences in legal frameworks and cultural attitudes toward self-reliance dramatically affect which items fall into forbidden territory and which remain freely accessible. The 2021 Texas winter storm crisis illustrated these disparities with brutal clarity when millions lost power for days not because of inadequate warnings, but because of systemic failures in infrastructure winterization that authorities had been cautioned about for a decade. More than 4.5 million Texans lost electricity, some for as long as 4 days, in what became the largest manually controlled load-shedding event in United States history. The Electric Reliability Council of Texas ordered 20,000 megawatts of rolling blackouts to prevent total grid collapse. Yet the tragedy killed numerous residents who lacked the backup systems and alternative resources that mainstream preparedness guides rarely mention. Federal authorities had warned repeatedly about the vulnerability of Texas energy infrastructure, particularly its lack of winterization. Yet these concerns were systematically ignored by ERCOT and state regulators who had dismantled oversight mechanisms just months before the storm. The Texas Public Utility Commission eliminated its oversight and enforcement division and severed ties with the Texas Reliability Entity, an independent monitor of grid reliability, thereby weakening enforcement of weatherization standards and failing to establish reserve margins that could have provided critical backup capacity during the crisis. Those who survived the longest blackouts with relative stability weren't necessarily those with the most expensive generator systems or the largest stockpiles of conventional supplies. They were individuals and families who possessed the quiet knowledge of alternative heating methods, water purification techniques beyond consumer filters, and communication systems that functioned without cell towers or internet connectivity. The architecture of modern supply chain vulnerability explains why forbidden items matter more now than at any previous point in American peacetime history. Our just-in-time logistics system, optimized for efficiency rather than resilience, means most urban and suburban areas maintain only 72 hours of food inventory in local stores before shelves empty during panic buying events. The 2024 Supply Chain Review documented ongoing fragility from multiple vectors, including labor strikes that paralyzed ports, natural disasters that disrupted transportation corridors, cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure, and geopolitical tensions that constrained international shipping. The Baltimore port collapse, combined with air cargo bottlenecks and coordinated labor actions across multiple transportation sectors, demonstrated how quickly localized disruptions cascade into regional shortages affecting everything from medical supplies to basic foodstuffs. When trucks stop rolling for any reason, fuel shortages, driver strikes, impassable roads, or economic collapse, the visible tier of preparedness gear becomes insufficient within days because it assumes temporary disruption rather than systemic breakdown. Standard advice focuses on surviving short-term emergencies, where external rescue eventually arrives, municipal water service eventually resumes, and store shelves eventually restock. But contemporary crises increasingly involve compounding failures, where electrical grids stay down for weeks, supply chains remain fractured for months, and governmental response capacity gets overwhelmed by the scale of simultaneous regional disasters. Hurricane Helene's 2024 impact across multiple southeastern states demonstrated this dynamic when entire counties went dark without power, internet, or cell service for extended periods. Amateur radio operators were airlifted into affected areas by Georgia State Patrol helicopters because roads remained blocked and conventional communication infrastructure had completely collapsed. The ham radio volunteers who maintained emergency coordination during that crisis possessed FCC licenses and equipment that most preppers never acquire despite their obvious utility when all else fails. This highlights the first category of forbidden items, not forbidden by law necessarily, but restricted by licensing requirements, expense, and the technical knowledge barrier that keeps most people dependent on fragile commercial infrastructure. Industrial-grade water purification chemicals represent perhaps the most practical yet legally ambiguous category of restricted preparedness supplies. Calcium hypochlorite, commonly sold as pool shock in concentrations of 68% or higher, can purify thousands of gallons of water using a fraction of the space required for consumer filter systems or bottled water stockpiles. The Environmental Protection Agency provides emergency guidance on using calcium hypochlorite for water disinfection, noting that 1 heaping teaspoon dissolved in 2 gallons of water creates a mother solution that can then be used to treat much larger quantities. A single 1-pound container of pool shock, costing approximately $20, can theoretically purify 33,000 gallons of water if properly diluted and administered, a capacity that no consumer filter system can match at comparable cost or storage footprint. Yet, bulk purchases of calcium hypochlorite raise immediate red flags because the same chemical serves as a precursor for certain improvised explosives, placing it on watch lists maintained by federal and state authorities monitoring potential terrorist activity. The chemical's extreme corrosive properties create legitimate storage hazards as well. It reacts violently with reducing agents, combustible materials, organic compounds, acids, and moisture, making it capable of corroding metals including stainless steel if improperly contained. Preppers who've stored calcium hypochlorite in emergency water kits alongside stainless steel filters have discovered months later that the chemical completely destroyed the filter housings through corrosive reactions, rendering their entire water purification setup useless. Safety data sheets warn that calcium hypochlorite is very hazardous if it contacts skin or eyes, or if inhaled or ingested, requiring gloves, goggles, and masks during handling. If the chemical gets wet, it can off-gas chlorine, and if certain petroleum products mix with it, the compound can spontaneously ignite in ways that ordinary fire extinguishers cannot control. Despite these legitimate dangers, experienced preppers continue stockpiling pool shock because they understand that water scarcity becomes the primary killer within days of infrastructure collapse, and municipal water treatment facilities require electricity to function. When the grid goes down for extended periods, wells pump only as long as backup generators have fuel. Surface water sources become contaminated by sewage overflows and industrial runoff, and bottled water vanishes from stores within hours of crisis recognition. The ability to chemically purify large volumes of water from questionable sources, rivers, ponds, rainwater collection, even swimming pools, transforms from theoretical preparedness into immediate survival necessity. The restricted nature of this item emerges not from blanket prohibition, but from the intersection of legitimate safety concerns, dual-use potential for harm, and surveillance frameworks designed to identify bulk chemical purchases that might indicate malicious intent rather than prudent preparation. Prescription medication stockpiling occupies an even more legally complex gray zone, where federal controlled substance regulations, state pharmacy board rules, medical licensing requirements, and insurance reimbursement policies create overlapping barriers to accumulating therapeutic reserves. Finland mandates that medicine producers and importers maintain 3 to 10 month stockpiles of critical medications specifically for emergency scenarios, including war and pandemics, a policy that proved invaluable when COVID-19 emerged and the government opened these strategic reserves to ensure continued access despite global supply chain disruptions. The United States maintains no comparable civilian medication reserve system, instead relying on just-in-time pharmaceutical supply chains that proved catastrophically inadequate during the pandemic when shortages affected everything from basic antibiotics to critical anesthetics. The FDA's Emergency Use Authorization Framework permits government stakeholders to pre-position medical countermeasures in anticipation of CBRN emergencies, but this applies only to institutional stockpiles rather than individual preparedness efforts. Individuals attempting to stockpile prescription medications face multiple obstacles, including physicians reluctant to write prescriptions beyond immediate therapeutic needs, pharmacists prohibited from dispensing quantities exceeding insurance-approved amounts, and controlled substance regulations that criminalize possession of certain medications without valid current prescriptions. Antibiotics represent the most commonly desired stockpile medication because bacterial infections become lethal without treatment. Yet most physicians refuse to prescribe antibiotics for hypothetical future infections rather than diagnosed current conditions. Some preppers obtain veterinary antibiotics marketed for fish or livestock, relying on the fact that many such formulations contain identical active ingredients to human pharmaceuticals, though this strategy carries serious risks including incorrect dosing, contamination, lack of quality control, and legal ambiguity about whether veterinary medications intended for animal use violate laws against practicing medicine without a license. Insulin-dependent diabetics face even more dire preparedness challenges because insulin requires refrigeration and has limited shelf life, making long-term stockpiling impractical without backup power systems that themselves require fuel, maintenance, and financial resources beyond most individuals' means. The cruel reality of prescription medication restrictions is that chronic conditions requiring daily pharmaceutical intervention become rapidly fatal during extended supply chain disruptions, transforming prescription dependence into a profound vulnerability that preparedness culture rarely addresses honestly, because the legal and practical barriers remain largely insurmountable for most people. Amateur radio communication systems illustrate how licensing requirements and technical complexity create forbidden status not through prohibition, but through accessibility barriers that most preppers never overcome. During Hurricane Helene, when conventional communication infrastructure collapsed across multiple counties, ham radio operators provided the only reliable coordination link between affected areas and emergency response teams. The Federal Communications Commission requires technician class licenses minimum for amateur radio operation, a barrier that demands studying technical material, passing examinations, and registering with federal authorities in ways that many preppers find intrusive or intimidating. Ham radio equipment itself ranges from relatively affordable handheld transceivers to sophisticated base stations costing thousands of dollars. But the real restriction emerges from the knowledge gap. Understanding radio propagation, frequency management, antenna design, and operational protocols requires sustained learning that mainstream preparedness culture largely ignores in favor of simpler consumer solutions. The limitation of consumer alternatives became apparent during recent crises when family radio service and general mobile radio service handheld units proved useful only for extremely local communication within direct line of sight, typically under 5 miles in practical conditions. When cell towers fail, internet goes dark, and landlines cut out, the ability to communicate beyond shouting distance requires either satellite systems, costing hundreds of dollars monthly, or radio equipment that demands licenses, technical knowledge, and infrastructure investment. Mesh network communication devices like GoTenna and Beartooth offer smartphone-to-smartphone connectivity without cell towers, creating ad hoc networks that can relay messages across multiple devices to extend range. But these systems cost hundreds of dollars per unit, require all participants to possess compatible hardware, and remain largely unknown outside specific prepper and technical communities. Off-grid communication represents perhaps the clearest example of forbidden preparedness, not prohibited by law for licensed operators, but restricted by economic barriers, knowledge requirements, and the social stigma attached to radio hobbyists who get dismissed as antiquated when cellular service functions normally. Yet when grid-down scenarios extend beyond days into weeks or months, the inability to coordinate with family members, receive information about evolving conditions, or call for help in medical emergencies transforms communication capability from convenience into life-or-death necessity that no amount of food stockpiles or water filters can compensate for when isolation becomes the primary threat multiplier. Body armor and ballistic protection exist in legal frameworks that vary dramatically by state, creating confusion about whether civilian ownership constitutes reasonable preparedness or crosses into prohibited territory. Federal law under 18 U.S. Code Section 931 generally permits law-abiding citizens to purchase, own, and wear body armor, but state restrictions add significant complexity to this baseline legality. Connecticut prohibits all online sales of body armor, requiring face-to-face transactions only, while New York implemented severe civilian restrictions in July 2022 that prohibit most civilians from purchasing or possessing body armor unless they work in specifically authorized professions like law enforcement or certain security roles. Most states follow a middle path where convicted felons cannot own body armor, and enhanced criminal penalties apply when body armor is worn during commission of violent felonies. But law-abiding citizens can legally acquire ballistic protection. The social stigma attached to civilian body armor ownership often exceeds the legal restrictions, with possession characterized as indicative of militia extremism or paranoid delusion, rather than reasonable preparation for civil unrest scenarios. Yet recent history repeatedly demonstrates that civil disorder, looting during natural disasters, and targeted violence during supply shortages create genuine threats to personal safety that body armor mitigates without requiring lethal force response. The ethical argument for body armor centers on its purely defensive nature. Unlike weapons that can be used offensively, ballistic protection only prevents injury to the wearer, making it perhaps the most morally straightforward security preparation available. Threat Level 2. Soft body armor, typically worn as concealed vests, protects against most handgun rounds and represents the practical choice for civilian preparedness, since rifle-rated plates add significant weight and bulk. The expense of quality body armor, ranging from $300 to over $1,000 depending on coverage area and threat level, places it beyond casual purchase while remaining accessible to those seriously committed to comprehensive preparedness. Storage considerations are minimal compared to food or water supplies, since body armor requires only climate-controlled dry conditions to maintain effectiveness over years or even decades. The forbidden nature of body armor emerges primarily from cultural stigma and scattered state restrictions rather than blanket prohibition. Yet this category perfectly illustrates how preparedness items become controversial through association with perceived extremism rather than objective assessment of utility during civil breakdown scenarios that history shows occur with disturbing regularity during major disasters. The remaining categories of forbidden preparedness items shift focus toward infrastructure independence and long-term sustainability, revealing how deeply contemporary American society relies on centralized systems that become catastrophic single points of failure during extended crises. Off-grid power generation represents perhaps the most legally complex category because multiple regulatory frameworks intersect to control how citizens produce, store, and consume electricity independently of utility companies. The Department of Energy acknowledges that micro-hydropower systems can provide reliable electricity generation for individual properties with adequate water flow, requiring turbines or water wheels to transform flowing water into rotational energy that drives electrical generators. Yet actually implementing such systems demands navigating water rights laws, environmental impact assessments, utility interconnection agreements, electrical safety inspections, building permits, and zoning restrictions that vary dramatically by jurisdiction. Micro-hydro installations face particularly stringent regulation because they divert water from natural watercourses, raising concerns about downstream impacts on ecosystems, agricultural water rights, and municipal water supplies. Small wind turbines encounter similar regulatory barriers, where systems larger than 3 kilowatts typically require renewable energy approvals involving environmental assessments, noise studies, setback requirements from property lines, and mandatory consultation with neighbors who might object to visual or acoustic impacts. The economic calculation for residential off-grid power becomes prohibitive when accounting for equipment costs, installation expenses, regulatory compliance fees, insurance requirements, and ongoing maintenance that most people lack the technical knowledge to perform themselves. Grid tie systems that remain connected to utility power while generating supplemental electricity face additional complexity because utilities impose technical requirements for automatic disconnect switches, anti-islanding protection, power quality standards, and often charge substantial interconnection fees that can exceed several $1,000s before any electricity gets generated. The forbidden nature of off-grid power emerges from this regulatory thicket that transforms what should be straightforward energy independence into a years-long permitting process requiring professional engineers, legal consultants, and financial resources that place true grid independence beyond the reach of average citizens. When the grid fails for extended periods, as occurred in Texas during February 2021, those rare individuals who maintained off-grid generating capacity weathered the crisis with minimal disruption while neighbors faced life-threatening cold and darkness. Yet the regulatory barriers that prevent widespread adoption of such systems remain firmly in place because utility companies and regulatory agencies prioritize centralized control over distributed resilience. Faraday cage construction and electromagnetic pulse protection equipment occupy a unique space where the threat remains theoretical for most people, yet potentially civilization-ending if it materializes through either solar storms or hostile action. The Carrington event of 1859 provides historical precedent for solar storms capable of inducing electrical currents powerful enough to damage or destroy unprotected electronics across entire continents, with contemporary NASA research confirming that a similar coronal mass ejection barely missed Earth on July 23, 2012, passing through the orbital space our planet occupied just days earlier. Modern civilization's dependence on microelectronics means that a Carrington-scale event would simultaneously disable power grids, communication networks, transportation systems, financial infrastructure, medical equipment, and water treatment facilities across affected regions, creating cascading failures that could require years to repair if replacement components themselves depend on manufacturing capacity that the event destroyed. Faraday cages function by creating conductive enclosures that block external electromagnetic fields from reaching sensitive electronics inside, with testing showing that simple constructions using cardboard boxes wrapped in aluminum foil can provide over 50 decibels of attenuation across most of the electromagnetic pulse spectrum if the foil forms a continuous shield without gaps. The practical challenge involves determining which devices merit protection given limited Faraday cage space: backup radios for receiving information, portable solar chargers for maintaining power to protected devices, medical equipment like CPAP machines for individuals with sleep apnea, spare vehicle electronics to restore transportation capability, and data storage devices containing critical documents and family records. The social stigma attached to EMP preparation derives from its association with doomsday prepping and conspiracy theories about government weapons testing, despite the fact that solar storm threats represent established scientific consensus rather than fringe speculation. The Department of Defense and critical infrastructure operators maintain extensive EMP hardening protocols precisely because the threat meets objective risk assessment criteria, yet civilian preparation remains dismissed as paranoid overreaction, even though the consequences of being wrong far exceed the minimal cost of basic Faraday cage protection. Metal trash cans with tight-fitting lids, ammunition cans with rubber gaskets, and anti-static bags provide effective low-cost shielding options that preppers quietly accumulate while rarely discussing publicly, because EMP preparation marks individuals as falling outside mainstream preparedness culture into territory associated with extremism rather than reasonable risk mitigation. Night vision and thermal optics illustrate how international traffic in arms regulations restrict civilian access to military-grade technologies that provide substantial advantages during grid-down scenarios requiring nocturnal movement or perimeter security. ITAR classifications place Generation 3 image intensifier tubes under strict export controls limiting sales to United States citizens and lawful permanent residents, with violations resulting in felony charges carrying heavy fines and potential imprisonment. The regulations extend beyond mere ownership restrictions to prohibit allowing non-citizens from even looking through Generation 3 night vision devices on American soil, or accessing operator manuals and technical documentation describing their use, requirements that many civilian owners remain unaware of until they inadvertently violate them. Advanced night vision optics provide such significant tactical advantages in low-light and combat environments that the government treats them as critical military technologies requiring the same export restrictions as sophisticated weapon systems. Thermal imaging devices detect infrared radiation emitted by heat sources, allowing users to identify warm-blooded animals, running vehicles, or recently occupied spaces in complete darkness or through visual obscurations like fog and smoke that defeat traditional night vision. The expensive quality night vision and thermal equipment places it beyond casual purchase with Generation 3 night vision devices starting around $3,000 and thermal monoculars beginning around $2,000 for entry-level units, with professional-grade systems costing substantially more. The practical applications during infrastructure collapse scenarios justify this investment for those seriously committed to comprehensive security, detecting approaching threats before they reach effective weapons range, navigating safely during blackout conditions without revealing position through flashlight use, locating lost family members in wilderness areas or collapsed structures, and identifying whether abandoned properties contain occupants before entering. The forbidden dimension emerges partly from expense and partly from ITAR restrictions, but primarily from the psychological barrier most civilians face in acknowledging that scenarios requiring tactical night vision capability represent plausible futures rather than Hollywood fantasies. Those who acquire such equipment rarely discuss it publicly, because doing so invites social judgment about paranoia and potentially unwanted attention from neighbors who might view night vision ownership as threatening rather than prudent, during an era when civil unrest, supply chain breakdowns, and infrastructure failures occur with increasing frequency across supposedly stable developed nations. If you're finding value in this examination of forbidden preparedness categories, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you'll know when we release content examining the practical realities of crisis resilience. Comment below with your city and country. Understanding the geographic distribution of preparedness awareness helps us develop content addressing regional differences in legal frameworks, climate challenges, and infrastructure vulnerabilities that affect what preparations make sense for your specific situation. Advanced first aid and trauma supplies represent medically sophisticated equipment that civilian preppers accumulate despite gray areas regarding whether their use during emergencies constitutes illegal practice of medicine. Tourniquets designed for controlling massive hemorrhage from extremity injuries, chest seals for treating sucking chest wounds caused by penetrating trauma, hemostatic gauze impregnated with agents that promote rapid blood clotting, and battlefield dressings developed for military combat casualties all exceed the scope of basic first aid taught in standard civilian courses. The legal ambiguity emerges because Good Samaritan laws in most states protect individuals rendering emergency assistance from liability if they act in good faith without expectation of compensation, yet these protections become murky when examining whether untrained civilians can legally apply advanced medical interventions that healthcare professionals typically perform. Trauma medicine training programs like Stop the Bleed teach civilians how to recognize life-threatening bleeding and apply appropriate interventions, including direct pressure, wound packing with hemostatic gauze, and tourniquet application, providing some legal and practical foundation for maintaining advanced supplies. The preparedness calculation recognizes that during mass casualty events, extended infrastructure failures, or remote location emergencies, professional emergency medical services may be unavailable or overwhelmed beyond capacity to respond to additional calls. Rural areas already face EMS response times measuring in tens of minutes under normal conditions, a delay that becomes fatal for arterial bleeding or tension pneumothorax, regardless of how quickly someone calls for help. The forbidden aspect derives from medical licensing laws designed to prevent untrained individuals from practicing medicine, combined with liability concerns about civilians using advanced equipment without proper training, creating a catch-22 where acquiring the supplies remains legal but using them occupies uncertain legal territory. Experienced preppers resolve this tension by seeking formal training through wilderness medicine courses, tactical emergency casualty care programs, or emergency medical technician certification, establishing documented competence that provides both practical skills and liability protection. The supplies themselves occupy minimal storage space and maintain shelf life measured in years for most items, making them practical additions to comprehensive preparedness inventories despite their controversial nature. Tourniquets manufactured to Committee on Tactical Combat casualty care specifications cost approximately $30 each, with recommendations suggesting multiple units for treating injuries to different limbs, while hemostatic gauze runs approximately $20 to $40 per package depending on brand and quantity. The psychological barrier most people face involves acknowledging that traumatic injuries requiring such interventions represent plausible scenarios during civil unrest, industrial accidents, natural disasters, or the simple reality of remote living where professional medical care remains hours away under the best circumstances. Mesh network communication devices exemplify technological solutions to grid-down communication challenges that remain largely unknown outside specific preparedness and technical communities, despite their proven effectiveness during recent disaster responses. Gotenna created mobile mesh networking following Hurricane Sandy in 2012, when approximately one-third of cell towers and significant portions of power infrastructure failed, leaving millions unable to communicate for extended periods. The technology enables smartphone-to-smartphone messaging without requiring cell towers, internet connectivity, or any external infrastructure by creating ad hoc networks where each device functions as both endpoint and relay, automatically routing messages through multiple intermediate devices to reach distant recipients. Emergency management agencies across the United States now deploy mesh networks during disaster response because they provide resilient connectivity that continues functioning when conventional infrastructure fails, as demonstrated when California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection used Gotenna Pro devices to maintain firefighter coordination in remote wildfire zones lacking cell service. The system allowed incident commanders to track personnel locations through GPS position sharing and maintain text communication for tactical coordination, even in areas where radio dead spots and terrain features blocked traditional communication methods. Humanitarian relief organizations established local Gotenna networks following disasters in Puerto Rico and elsewhere to coordinate relief workers, manage supply distribution, and allow affected populations to send messages when cut off from conventional networks. The limitation for civilian preparedness involves the requirement that all participants possess compatible devices, typically costing several $100s per unit, creating network effects where isolated individuals gain minimal benefit while connected groups achieve communication resilience proportional to network density. The devices operate on license-free frequencies, meaning no FCC amateur radio license requirements, unlike ham equipment, lowering one barrier to adoption while the cost and awareness gaps maintain their status as forbidden knowledge outside dedicated prepper circles. Consumer Gotenna mesh devices don't include dedicated SOS functions that directly contact emergency services like personal locator beacons or satellite messengers, instead routing emergency messages to other nearby Gotenna users or preset contacts if someone in the mesh network has cell or internet connectivity. This design reflects the fundamental difference between satellite communication systems that provide global reach at ongoing subscription costs versus mesh networks that offer free local communication without recurring fees, but require building user density before achieving practical utility. The strategic preparedness value lies in coordinating family members, neighborhood security, resource sharing, and mutual assistance during extended infrastructure failures, when isolation amplifies every other threat multiplier. Long-term sanitation systems remain perhaps the most socially taboo category of forbidden preparedness, despite representing critical public health infrastructure that prevents disease outbreaks during extended grid-down scenarios. Composting toilets eliminate water-based waste disposal entirely, saving over 6,600 gallons of water per person annually while converting human waste into pathogen-free compost through controlled decomposition processes that typically require 6 months to 2 years depending on temperature, humidity, and carbon-to-nitrogen ratio management. The advantages during infrastructure failure scenarios are obvious. Independence from sewer systems that fail during earthquakes, floods, and prolonged blackouts. Water conservation when municipal supplies become contaminated or unavailable, and waste processing that prevents the environmental and health catastrophes that emerge when raw sewage accumulates in populated areas lacking functional sanitation infrastructure. The social stigma attached to discussing human waste management keeps most preparedness content focused on more palatable topics like food storage and water filtration. Yet the historical reality shows that cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases kill more people during infrastructure collapse than starvation or violence combined. Off-grid sanitation options range from commercial composting toilet systems, costing several $1,000s, to improvised bucket toilets using plastic bags, and chemical treatments costing minimal amounts but requiring regular waste disposal. The legal barriers emerge from health codes designed for stable infrastructure environments that prohibit composting toilet installation in many jurisdictions without special permits, restrict waste disposal options, and assume perpetual availability of municipal sewer services. Urban and suburban residents face particular challenges because property sizes limit options for safely composting human manure away from water sources and neighbors, while multifamily housing presents nearly insurmountable obstacles to implementing individual sanitation solutions. The preparedness calculation must weigh realistic assessment of how long alternative sanitation might be required against storage and legal constraints, with short-term solutions like chemical camping toilets providing interim capability, while long-term scenarios demand more sophisticated systems that most people lack space, resources, or legal permission to install. The forbidden dimension reflects profound cultural discomfort with confronting the reality that flush toilets represent relatively recent technological innovations dependent on continuous infrastructure operation, and their failure returns populations to sanitation conditions that killed millions throughout history when humans concentrated in urban areas without adequate waste management. Heirloom seed banks and agricultural self-sufficiency tools complete the forbidden inventory by addressing the longest-term survival scenario, where supply chains don't merely experience temporary disruption, but suffer permanent fracture requiring populations to produce food locally rather than depending on industrial agriculture and global distribution networks. Native American communities pioneered seed rematriation movements beginning in the late 1970s, working to recover traditional crop varieties from museums, universities, and government seed banks and return them to tribes for cultivation and sharing. The Cherokee Nation Seed Bank distributed over 9,500 seed packages to tribal members during 2023 alone, with demand so intense that supplies typically exhaust within hours of availability. These heirloom varieties represent genetic diversity developed over centuries by indigenous farmers who selected for adaptation to specific climates, soils, and growing conditions, creating resilience against crop failures that affect industrial monocultures engineered for maximum yield under optimal conditions. The preparedness logic recognizes that hybrid and genetically modified seeds dominate commercial agriculture because they produce higher yields under industrial farming methods. but these varieties typically cannot reproduce true to type from saved seeds, creating permanent dependence on seed companies for each planting season. Heirloom open-pollinated varieties allow farmers to save seeds from best-performing plants, maintaining food production capability indefinitely without external inputs beyond land, water, sunlight, and knowledge. The USDA now partners with tribal organizations and indigenous seed networks to support seed-saving efforts, investing in seed cleaning equipment, funding native seed propagation projects, and launching educational series recognizing that preserving agricultural biodiversity provides insurance against climate change and other threats to industrial food systems. Creating personal seed vaults with heirloom varieties of staple crops including tomatoes, beans, squash, and leafy greens allows individuals to store genetic potential for future food production in compact form, requiring only cool, dry storage conditions. The forbidden aspect emerges not from legal prohibition, but from mainstream dismissal of agricultural self-sufficiency as impractical romanticism by populations multiple generations removed from food production knowledge. Modern Americans overwhelmingly lack the skills required to grow substantial portions of their caloric intake even if they possess seeds and land, making seed banks symbolically important but practically useless without concurrent investment in learning traditional agricultural methods, food preservation techniques, and seasonal planning that subsistence farming demands. The long timeline required to develop such capabilities means that seed banking represents preparation for scenarios extending years into the future, far beyond the weeks or months that most preparedness planning addresses. The fundamental insight emerging from examining these 17 categories of forbidden preparedness items is that the true restriction isn't the gear itself, but rather the psychological shift required to acknowledge that the systems undergirding contemporary American life remain far more fragile than most citizens recognize or authorities admit. Every category discussed represents a specific failure mode of centralized infrastructure: water treatment plants that require electricity, pharmaceutical supply chains dependent on just-in-time logistics, communication networks vulnerable to single-point failures, power grids lacking redundancy, sanitation systems assuming perpetual operation, and food distribution requiring continuous transportation. The Great Depression generation that survived economic collapse did so not because they possessed superior equipment, but because they maintained skills, community networks, and mental resilience that modern populations have systematically lost through specialization and dependence on complex systems. Contemporary comparisons to the 2021 Texas freeze demonstrate this dynamic where individuals with off-grid heating capability, water purification knowledge, and community support systems fared exponentially better than neighbors possessing expensive gear but lacking practical experience and social connections. American individualism emphasizes self-reliance over collective dependence in ways that distinguish United States preparedness culture from European models built around greater state support, yet this philosophical commitment to personal responsibility remains largely rhetorical rather than practiced. The geographic reality of American infrastructure being far more dispersed than in densely populated European and Asian nations means rural and suburban preppers face different challenges than urban counterparts, with distance from mutual aid amplifying the importance of individual capability. The case of Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria illustrates how communities with strong social bonds and improvisation skills recovered faster than isolated preppers with expensive equipment, revealing that no amount of gear compensates for lack of training, physical fitness, community trust, adaptability, and knowledge. The forbidden truth that preparedness culture rarely acknowledges is that acquiring items represents the easiest and least important dimension of crisis resilience compared to developing skills, maintaining health, building relationships, and cultivating the psychological flexibility required to function effectively when familiar systems fail. Our ancestors didn't survive hardship because they had everything. They survived because they knew how to make do with what they had, improvising solutions to novel problems using available materials and collective knowledge. The forbidden knowledge isn't contained in the 17 categories cataloged here, but rather in remembering that self-reliance represents an American birthright rather than fringe belief. and that taking responsibility for family security during governmental and economic uncertainty constitutes the highest expression of citizenship rather than antisocial paranoia. The choice facing each individual involves deciding whether to remain dependent on systems demonstrably prone to failure or to quietly develop the capabilities that transform crises from catastrophes into manageable challenges, understanding that this preparation serves not only personal survival, but reduces burden on emergency services and community resources when disasters inevitably strike.